Okay, so what questions might we have now out of 1.6? Okay, sure. Question number 16.
Number 17.
Yep, 16 and 17. Okay. Let's see. What other ones would you like me to go over with you? Any others to look at out of 1.6? Sure. Which one?
2.
2. All right. Yep, no problem. Okay. Any others? What about 1.7 now? Sure. Question number 5. And which one?
6.
5 and 6. Okay.
11.
Sure. Number 11. Anything else? 10. Sure. Mark this being here. All right. Let me mark you off as being here. Okay. Okay. Any others? So I'm going to take care of all those questions then. All right. Okay. So let's now go ahead and look at 1.6. And we'll look at question number 2. And we can add more to the list if we need to. So we can always add more if we need to. And this one we asked about, I'm sure, because of the fractions. And fractions are one of those things we just have to deal with. Once we get used to working with them, they're really not that difficult, though. So this is what we've got, and we're going to be using the distributive property. So how does the distributive property work? Well, for the distributive property, we take whatever's out in front, and we distribute it or push it through. Now, with these fractions, we're going to write them over to the side. And if we have a whole number, we're going to put that whole number over 1. And then we can cross cancel as needed and multiply across. So let's look at the first piece. So we've got 3/5. And we're going to multiply that by 25, and we can put the x on top. 25x over 1. So that's what we're working with here. And you can use parentheses, or you can use a multiplication dot, or just put them back to back like that. As long as you understand that's multiplication. And what are we going to do? Well, we're multiplying. So when you multiply, we can cross cancel. So that 25 and that 5, they both have a 5 in common. So that's going to leave a 1 below and a 5 on the top. And now we can just multiply across. So 3 times 5 makes it 15, and the x just comes along for the right. Now down below, we don't need to write the 1 because all we've got is 1, and 15 over 1 is just 15. We then repeat the process for the y, which is going to be the same in this case. So we have 3/5 times your 25y over 1. 25 and the 5 can cancel. And multiplying across again, 3 times the 5 makes it 15. And so that's going to be 15y. So that's now going to leave me with 15x plus 15y for my final answer there. So that's how we handle that one. What we did was we just write the fractions over to the side. Now, whenever we multiply a fraction and a whole number, we can put that whole number over 1. And then we can cross cancel as needed or just multiply. And if it's over 1, we don't have to write it over 1. Right? Because we know that 15 over 1 is there, but we don't really have to write it over 1. And we just bring the x along with it, and we bring the y along with it. So that was using our distributive property. And we distributed through that fraction. Question 16. We want to choose the equivalent expression. And so what we've got here is we've got 9x plus 7y out in front. And then we've got 3y squared behind. So we want to see which of these choices is the same. So I'm going to write them all up, and we're going to figure out which ones work and which ones don't work and why. So we'll go through these. Oops, 7y there. And so that's A. We've got choice B. So there's that one. We've got choice C. And we're looking for which one's going to be the same. Okay, I'll mark it down as being here. And choice C is 9x plus 3y squared times 7y. Okay, and only one of these is going to work for us. 7x plus 7y plus 3y squared. And that's choice D. Now, when we look at this, I can tell you that choice A is the correct one. Okay? But let's see why B doesn't work. Well, this doesn't even look like that at all, does it? Right? If I was going to use the distributive property, all I could do is distribute that through. So that 3y squared would have to go to each piece. So it would have to be attached up here as a 3y squared as well, because you'd have to distribute it through. So since it doesn't have that 3y squared for both parts, B is not going to work. Question C, you can't rearrange what's inside of here and trade it with what's outside. So that 3y squared is outside, so it has to stay outside. You can switch the order on the inside, but you can't take things and move them from one parenthesis to the other. And same thing with this one. We can't rearrange parentheses like this. Now, why does A work? So A is going to be the correct answer. And let's talk about why A would be the correct answer. Well, when we work with multiplication, we've got some different properties. So we've got the commutative property, and we've got the associative property and the distributive property. So what we can do is with multiplication, we can rearrange the order with the commutative property. So I can take this 3y squared that's behind, and I can put it in front. Because multiplication, you can do that. You can change the order in multiplication. Because 3 times 5 is the same thing as 5 times 3, right? You can switch the order. So I can put this 3y squared in front, and it'll be the same. I can rearrange the order of the terms inside, and it'll be the same. Remember, you can switch the order. You just can't change how things are put together with the groupings. Right? And this doesn't work because, again, that would have to be distributed through each part. If you had this, it would work. If you had a 3y squared there with that as well, that would work. But we don't, so that one is not the correct answer. That one, you can't switch inside and outside parentheses. And on this one, you can't regroup like that. So the only one that works is answer A, and that's because we can use the commutative property to switch that 3y squared to the front. Question 17. Is everyone okay with that one? Everyone see why the other choices don't work? Question 17. We want to find this sum. And you can use a calculator if you want, or we can do it with our properties. I'm just going to rewrite things to make it a little bit easier. So what I can do is I can rearrange this in a different order, and we don't need all these extra signs. So I'm going to rearrange things to make it look easier to see, and we're going to get rid of some of these excessive signs, because the double negative, the negative and the positive here, see, those are back to back, so that's going to be negative. The same thing here. Now let's apply our commutative property. Again, you could just type this straight in the calculator if you wanted. But let's rearrange it and make it a little bit easier. And we'll just use our mental math skills. So let's rearrange this as this with the commutative property. I'm going to rearrange them in a different order. Okay, you can do that. Okay? The negative and the positive, when they're back to back like that with the parentheses, that makes that negative. So now we've gotten to here, and why did I rearrange it this way? Well, this is easy to do now mentally, because 159 minus 9, well, that's easy to see. That's 150. And we know negative 8 and positive 8, that's what? 0, right? So I could add those together, and I could easily see that that's 150. And you could have done it a different way. I just used the commutative property, right? So I just switched the order around. Whenever you change the order, that's using the commutative property. That's question 17. Are there any others out of 1/6 to look at? Anything else out of 1/6 here? So hopefully those are kind of making sense. I know the properties, we use them. We just don't ever really remember the names and name them. But we use the properties all the time. So now let's move on then to 1/7. We're now going to look at 1.7, and we're going to start with question 5. And on question 5, we want a numerical coefficient of 4. And so when I talk about the numerical coefficient, what does that mean? That means the number in front. Okay, so the number in front of the variable has to be a 4. So let's see what we've got for choices. We've got A, which is x to the 4th. We've got choice B, which is a 4x to the 6th, y. We've got choice C, which is a 4 squared, x squared. And we've got choice D, which is an x over 4. Now we want a coefficient of 4. So I'm going to go ahead and write down the coefficients below each one. And we'll see which one has a coefficient of 4. So on the first one, on A, there's no number in front of that x to the 4th. So we know there's a 1 there. So my coefficient on that one would be a 1. And we need a 4. So that doesn't work. Okay, part B, the number in front is a 4. So my coefficient on B is a 4. That one's going to work for us. Now, why does C not work? Well, C doesn't work because that's 4 squared. And 4 squared is what? 16. So C, it would have a 16 in front. And D doesn't work either. Why not? Because the 4 is below. And that would have a coefficient of, if you rewrite that, as 1/4 x. So your coefficient here would be 1/4, right? Because you could rewrite it that way. So the only one that's going to work for us is going to be what? Is going to be B, because your number in front, in this case, is a 4. So this one's a 1. 4 squared is 16. And that 4 below, well, rewriting, that makes it a coefficient of a 4. So the only one that works there is going to be answer B. Is everyone all right with how I got the coefficients there? Coefficients are just the numbers in front. So don't try to make it more difficult than what it needs to be. And like on this one, we have to square first, because that 4 was squared. Question 6. Question 6 has got fractions. So we're going to take our time and combine these fractions together. So we have minus 1/12 plus 9y plus 13/12 y minus 13 plus 11/12 y. So what are we going to try and do here? Well, we're going to try and combine these fractions together. Now the good thing is they all have the same denominator. All the fractions have a denominator of 12. We're going to go ahead and look at the y part first. So let's go ahead and identify every piece that has a y on it. So everything that's got a y, we're going to go ahead and underline there. I'll get a better marker. So these are all going to go together. And again, I'm going to write it over to the side. And then we'll work with our fractions. So this is going to be our y part here. So everything that's got a y attached to it is going over here. We'll leave a little bit of space because we'll need a common denominator here. Yep. And then we need a positive 11/12y. Let's make sure we copied it all down correctly because it's easy to write something down wrong. Looks like they're all correct here. Okay, now we can approach it different ways. Let's see what we can do first. Let's try to go ahead and just combine these together because those have the same denominator. That might be the first place to start. You could also multiply this 9 by a 12/12 and then just simply add them all together. But let's go ahead and just see what happens with these. So if I combine these together, I've got a 13 and an 11. So that's going to make it a 24/12y. And what do we know about 24/12? Well, 24/12, 24 divided by 12 is a 2. So that piece comes out to be a 2, right? And then we'll just bring down that 9y. Is everyone okay with that so far? That's the easiest way to, I think, do this one. Now what can we do? Well, now they're the same. These are both whole numbers. They both have y's in common, so they're like terms. We can add these together, and so the y part is going to now be 11y. Is everyone okay with what I did for the y part? It's very easy. Same denominators, they just quickly went together. Now let's see what we've got for everything that doesn't have a y. Well, what do we have that doesn't have a y? Well, if it doesn't have a y, we're going to put them behind, and we have a minus 1/12 and a minus 13. So those are the two components that don't have a y on them. We can either write this as a mixed fraction or an improper one. Let's use improper fractions. We normally use improper fractions unless it's an application. So if it's an application, you might write, in this case, negative 13 and 1/12. But normally we would write that as an improper fraction because they're easier to work with. So let's go ahead. This is not an application. Let's go ahead and write this as an improper fraction. So I'm going to write this as 13/1. And we want common denominators, so I'm going to use a 12/12 here. That's going to give me then my common denominator. So now we've got a minus 1/12, and we've got 13 times 12 here, and it's negative again. It's a minus 156/12. They're both negative, so they go together. My sign would be negative when I add them. And that's a minus 157/12. That's where we would write the answer. Now, I would have also accepted a minus 13 and a 12. Same thing. Either one, they're the same. Normally, though, we write them as improper fractions. But I would again take a negative 13/12 also. Does everyone kind of see what how that works? So I did the y part separately, put my fractions together for it. That went away because 24/12, that reduced down to a 2. And then I can just bring down the 9y, add them together, and I get my 11y. And then we've got our numbers left. Okay? Those don't have a y, so those went together. We got our common denominator, and that left us with our final answer. I'm going to write that. And again, you kind of see how I'm working these out. What I generally do is if I have fractions, I draw my line here and I separate. So on the left side, I try to keep this as clean as possible. You don't want it to be work everywhere. You want it to be separated out. You really want to be organized. Otherwise, you'll forget what you're doing and mix all the pieces together. So I like to break it up into little compartments. So I did the y part here in this compartment. Then I did the fractional numbers down here. And then I just put them all together. But that's going to be the easiest way to work these out, is to break it into pieces. Always make sure that left side, that's just the way I do them, left side stays clean. The right side is all your work, so it can be whatever you need it to be. But that's where students struggle the most, is they go to work things out and they get confused as to what went where. And yeah, it's easier if we just break it into pieces. So question number 10. We want to go ahead and write this in words. So we're not going to break it down. We're going to write this in terms of words. Okay. So how would we write this in terms of words? Well, this would be, on the first piece, 4 times the variable m, right? So that's that piece. Now let's talk about inside the parentheses. Okay, so inside the parentheses, you've got the variable m plus 16. So there's that piece, the variable m plus 16. Now we need to put them together. So how do we put them together? Well, we got subtraction. So if I was to rewrite this as a verbal expression instead of a mathematical one, we would have 4 times the variable m minus the variable m plus 16. That's how I'd write it in words. And you can write 16 out if you'd rather. Using the number there, that's fine. So it's going to be 4 times the variable m, that's that piece. And then we say minus, because that's going to be subtracted off. And what are we going to take away from that? The variable m plus 16. So 4 times the variable m, that's that piece, minus whatever's behind it, which in this case is the variable m plus 16. And you could write it different ways. That's just one way I chose to write it. But there's other ways you could do it as well. Question 11 is a good question because it makes us use the order of operations. We go through our different properties. Okay, so this is a good problem to look at because this makes us use our different properties. Now, we want to simplify this down as far as we possibly can. And remember, order of operations, well, what's the first thing we do? Parentheses are up top, right? So I look inside, and I have a 7 minus 8t. Can the 7 and the 8t go together? No. Why not? Because one has the variable t, one does not. So then we move on. We have no square roots and no powers. So then we do our multiplication. When you distribute, that's multiplication. And we have a negative in front of the parentheses, so we're going to distribute or push through that negative. So I always like to circle it. So I circle that negative, and then I draw arrows so I remember it's got to be distributed through. Now I can rewrite this as a minus 2. Distributing the negative through, I have a minus 7. And negative makes it a positive 8t there. So now can we combine together? Well, now if we want to combine things together, those are numbers so they can go together. And generally we write the variable first. So I'm going to write the 8t first. And then we have minus 2 and minus 7. Those are both negative. They go together. And that makes it a minus 9. So my final answer there would then be 8t minus 9. If you wrote it the opposite way, it's fine. This is okay as well. You could also write it as this. Either way, I would accept either one because they're the same. All we did was switch the order. But normally what we do, just so we have some standardization, is we usually write the variable first. Any other questions out of 1-7 to look at? Anything else? Okay, we'll spend a little bit of time here going over some of the questions on our practice exam. And then I'll post a worked out answer key as well. I'll work on that tomorrow. And I'll show you step by step how I worked all of these out. I did change it from last semester, so it's a little bit different, but I'll rework it again. And I'll put that in Canvas for you. So that'll be put on either tomorrow or later in the week. Where students struggle at the most is identifying the properties. So we're going to go over specifically the ones that have the different properties. So we want to find the inverse property. And we've got choices. So we need to figure out which one is going to be an inverse. Okay, so we want the inverse. Now, what does inverse mean? Well, inverse means the opposite, right? So we're going to have to work with opposites here. Okay, so let's see which ones are going to work and there's only one that'll work and which ones don't. So let's just talk about the ones that don't work. And we'll just start from part D. Why is part D not going to work? Now look and see if they even make sense or not. D doesn't even make sense. Why not? Those have different denominators, right? And for them to equal 0, they have to be identical, right? One positive, one negative. So negative 7/9 plus 9/7, right? Those can't go together, different denominators. Definitely does not equal 0. So see, D doesn't work because of those denominators. Now, why does C not work? Well, if I worked out C and I multiplied, would I get 1? I don't think so. Because negative 7 times negative 7, that's a positive 49. And 9 times 9 is an 81. And does that equal 1? Clearly, that does not equal 1, does it? So you've got to look at each one. Now let's look at part B. Well, part B, it's going to work because what would happen here? If I multiply the 7s, they cancel. The 9s, they do what? Cancel. Negative and negative makes it a positive 1, and 1 does equal 1. So B is going to work. Why does D not work? Or, sorry, A not work. So we've got B is the correct answer. Why does A not work? Well, if we multiply these out, Those can cancel again, right? But we get 1, and 1 does not equal what? 0. So we have to go through each of these and find the one that's the same. Now, once you find the one that's the same, then you can stop. I went through each one, so you can see you've got to look at all the pieces and see how they go together. When we look at reciprocals, because these are reciprocals here, and so are these. When we multiply reciprocals, they should equal 1, not 0, 1. So, question 2. What property is used to clear these parentheses? So let's talk about our properties. What do we have for properties? We have the associative property, we've got the commutative property, we've got the distributive property, we've got the inverse property, we've got the identity. When I distribute or push through that 5, right, to make that come out to this, what property is being used? Distributive property. So I'm just going to abbreviate that, distributive property. Question 3 is another one that sometimes students struggle with. It's very easy though. Now we have to make sure that when we talk about the lesser number, that is going to be the one that's furthest on the left on the number line. So what are our two numbers going to be? Well, 1 is our first one. And what about this? Remember, do we cancel these negatives out? No, because what do we do first? Absolute values go first, right? Okay, so if I was going to work this piece out right here, what would I do first? I would do the absolute value of 5, and then what's along with it? Out in front still. Negative. Okay, so which one's smaller? Yep, negative 5 is the lesser number, so negative 5 here would be your answer. Or you could write it as minus absolute value minus 5. They're the same thing. Right? So either one. You could either break it down, or I think they wrote it like this in the key. That's going to be your smaller number. And remember, resist the urge here to cancel out those double negatives. Why? Because absolute values are done at the very beginning. When we cancel the signs out, what is this? Multiplication. Absolute values are here, multiplication's below it. Number 4, I think we're okay with. What do? We plug in these numbers from our set, and we figure out which one makes it work. And we've done a lot of those, so I don't think we'll struggle so much with 4. What about 5? When we talk about numbers, numbers are more than one type. So when we talk about numbers, first off, everything is always a real number. And we ask ourselves this question. Is negative 3/4, is it rational or is it irrational? And what's the difference? Well, let's just take a moment to review. Rational numbers, what are those? Those are whole numbers, fractions, and decimals that stop. What are irrational numbers? Well, irrational numbers are special numbers like pi, and decimals that never ever stop. So we now know that this negative 3/4, well, that's definitely going to be a rational number. So that means we can get rid of B and D, right? Because it's rational, not irrational. Now, what do we know about negative 3/4? Well, we know it's rational, okay? And is it a natural number? Clearly not. Is it a whole number? No, because those are fractions as well. But it is rational, and rational numbers are also what? Real. Everything's a real number. So which one can I get rid of? I can get rid of A, because negative 3/4 is clearly not a natural number. So C would be the correct answer. It's a rational number, and it's also real. And I think we'll look at question 6 as well, because sometimes we struggle with these. What about the community property? What do we know about community property? When I talk about community property, what does that mean? Well, associative property means groupings, right? So that's parentheses. Community property, what does that mean? That means we switch the order. So we switch the order in which they're written. So we're going to go through and we're going to see which one of these is the community property. Well, A doesn't work because A is the identity property. Because when you add 0 to something, it doesn't change it. We didn't change the order at all. So A would be the identity property, and that's not the community property. So A doesn't work. What about B? Okay, well, B, we switch things around, okay, and look at the groupings. Did we change what was grouped together? No. All we did was change the what? Order. So we switched the order of the groupings. So B is probably going to be our answer, but let's look at the others. C. Why does C not work? C doesn't work because I didn't change the order. What did I change? I just changed the groupings, right? So that's associative. So C doesn't work. And what about D? D doesn't even look right at all. So the only one that's an example of the community property is going to be what? B. Why is it the community property? Because I switched that 9 from behind to the front. And I did not change what was inside the parentheses. Question 8. You can just work on that one on your own. Now, all you need to do on this one is plug in values. So what it says is assume that A is positive, B is negative, and C is positive. So they tell you what they are. And then they want you to tell me what kind of number is going to come out. Well, we need to pick numbers to plug in. So what do we know about A? Positive. So let's pick an easy number to work with. How about 2? 2 is a positive number. You can use any number for A. Just make sure it is what? Positive. Okay? What about B? B is negative. So let's say we pick a negative 3. You just make sure it's negative. And what do we know about C? Positive. So how about we pick 4? It doesn't matter what numbers you pick. Just make sure A is positive, B is negative, and C is positive. And now what's going to happen when I multiply these together? So that's what I've got. If I plug in my values for A, B, and C, that's what I've got. Now we have to be careful with our signs here. Because we plugged in B, which was that negative 3. And what happens when we square a negative number? If we work with negative 3 squared, negative 3 and negative 3, that's going to be a what? Positive 9. And now when we multiply all this together, we end up with a 72, and so it's positive. Why is it a positive 9 here? Because when I square a negative number, negative 3 squared, that's negative 3 times negative 3 wrote out, and that's positive 9. So that's why this is going to be positive. Okay, because A was positive, B was negative. So we just plugged in numbers to see how it worked. C was positive. And that negative, when we square it, became positive. All of them multiply together to make it then what? Positive. 9, question 9 here, I think you can do that on your own. Again, I'll post a key later on so you can check your work. You just plug the values in. And question 10. I do want to go over the ones that are properties, just so we understand what the properties are and how they work. Question 10, we want the identity property. Now, what does identity mean? If we think of identical twins are the what? Same. Okay? So, what's going to make it the same? Well, if I add 0 to something, it makes it the same, right? It stays the same. Adding 0 doesn't change it. When I multiply something by 0, it makes it 0. So A obviously doesn't work because that's multiplication. B is going to be our answer. And C, when we talk about C, we want the identity, which means the sides are the same. And 4x is not the same as 0. And D would be the inverse. Because what's the inverse of a positive 4? A negative 4. And that one doesn't work. Sides aren't the same. So we want B, because adding 0 to something doesn't change it. That keeps it the same. Question 12, the associative property. What about the associative property? Well, when we talk about the associative property, are we changing the order? No. What are we changing? Parentheses, the groupings. Okay, so let's look and see what we've got here. Okay, let's look at A. Okay, A doesn't work. Why not? Now watch all the pieces here. This is 7 plus 2 plus 1. 7 plus 2 plus 7. So that one doesn't work. Okay, so I don't think A will work. Unless there's a mistake in the key. Hopefully there's not. Hopefully they're all right here. Okay, what about B? Why does B not work? I didn't change the groupings. I added 0. This is identity. Adding 0 doesn't change it, so that doesn't work. Okay, what about C? C doesn't work. Why would C not work? I'm sorry, D's going to be our answer. But let's talk about why C doesn't work. Okay, C doesn't work because what? I didn't change the groupings. I changed the what? Order. Right? 2 and 7. 7 and 2. That's commutative. What about D? Okay, D works. Why does D work? Because when I look at D, the order is the same. 7, 2, and 1. 7, 2, and 1. But what did I change? I changed the placement of the parentheses, not the order. When you change the placement of the parentheses, that makes it associative. This one doesn't work because of the numbers. You've got to be very careful and look at them, right? This one's a 1, that one's a 7. So that was just a trick question there. B is the identity, because adding 0 doesn't change it. C doesn't work because I changed the order. This would be commutative, but D does work. Question 13, you can try that one on your own. You'll just have to make a table. Question 15, we'll just go through this one pretty quickly here. Question 15, which one is using the distributive property? Obviously, A doesn't work, right? Because distributive property means I distribute or I push it through. Well, I didn't distribute that through. B doesn't work because the signs are wrong. Because that should be distributed through with that negative. So B doesn't work because the signs are wrong. C, we don't do that. But D is the correct answer because when I distribute that negative 9 through, that gives me a minus 9x minus 9. So that would make it the distributive property. So D is going to be the correct answer on that. Question 17. This one, you can look at it and you can tell if this is true or false. Do you think I can break this up like that with that square? No, you cannot do that, right? Because parentheses go first. You'd have to do the inside first and then the square. You can't split it up like this. It doesn't work. Those are not the same. When it comes to the parentheses, you can't break them apart. You have to do the square first. So these are not the same, and this one would be false because they're different. And it's just a matter of looking at it and noticing you can't split that up. We've never done it that way before. It cannot be done that way. 18 is a fraction one. If we need to, we can go over that one next week before our exam. 19, we plug values in. 20 we've talked about before. Same thing with 21, 22. I think we've covered all the rest of them. I just wanted to make sure we went over the properties because those are the most commonly missed ones. They're not hard, but it's easy to make a mistake on those properties. So I wanted to make sure that we covered all of those. So we'll go ahead now and we'll take a short break, and then we'll come back, and we're going to start Chapter 2. So let's take a short break, and let's meet back here at 9:30. Right? So we'll be back here in about 10 minutes, a little over 10 minutes.